I've written a book called How to Change the Way You Look at Things in Plain English. And it's just about how to change your perspective on something and how useful that is. It can really change the way you interact with the world, and it can change your results dramatically and change the way you feel about things dramatically. So this is just going to be some examples of a change in perspective and some ideas about how to go about creating a new perspective on something. Because you're not at the mercy of whether lightning strikes you or not. You can generate new perspectives on things, and it can really change how things go for you. A good example of this is something my wife is doing right now. So she got the idea a while back. She's like, a terminal diagnosis can really change someone's life. I mean, when somebody finds out they only have a little time left to live, they really see things differently. It changes their perspective on their own life. And my wife's idea is that I wonder if there's a way that you could do that without a terminal diagnosis. I wonder if there's a way you could do that deliberately. So she started with reading books on death of various kinds. One was by a guy that was dying. One was a man who works in a hospice, so he's dealt with a lot of people dying over his career. And there was a couple more. I can't remember what else they were, but they were all basically, she was trying to confront her own death and her own limited amount of life. I mean, we all have a limited amount of life. It's just that people, they get a terminal diagnosis, get a wake-up call that it's sooner than they thought. But we all have no idea how long we have left. But generally speaking, don't really behave that way, don't really look at it that way, and in a way miss out on something because of it. So she was trying to live with death at her side, which is one of the way this Buddhist guy put it. And in her doing that, it's really changed my perspective too. It's really worth doing. It sounds grim, and in a way it is, but in another way, it's very enlivening. It really does change what you think is important, what's worth doing and what's not worth doing, and what's worth being concerned about and what's not being concerned about. So that's a really dramatic shift in perspective. And she did it deliberately. And it really has had an effect on her, on me, and on our relationship for the better. Carl Sagan said he recommended almost dying to everyone. I think he got 3 different terminal diagnoses, or he was diagnosed with cancer, went through radiation and chemotherapy. I don't know exactly what happened, but I think 3 different times he got a serious diagnosis of cancer, survived the first 2, but the last one killed him. And he said it really did change his perspective and really changed the way he treated the people he loved and stuff like that. The usual. I mean, I'm sure you probably even personally experienced how people can change when they know they're going to die. So, but you can create that change on your own. And my wife's method is one way of doing that. I think probably it would be best if you thought of a particular problem or something that you resist about your life, something you don't like, wish you could change, or know that you can't change and you're unhappy about. Think of one of those, just one. Pick a good one, something that you'd really love to have a new perspective about. And think of that while we're talking about this stuff. So one of the ways to get a new perspective on something is to read about it or to learn about it in some way. And I have a personal experience that's a good example of that. I had always been shy when I was a kid. It was a very salient characteristic. Anybody that knew me would have characterized me as that. It probably would have been the first thing they said about me. And I changed that at one point. I changed the way I looked at that, and it really did change that. I'm not shy anymore. It didn't, like, the piece of information didn't change me completely right then, but it gave me a path to not being shy anymore. So the piece of information I got was from a book called The Charisma Quotient. And they just talked about how lots of very charismatic, well-known people were shy to begin with. And that shyness is actually an indication of one skill that you need in order to be charismatic, and all that's missing is some other skills. Specifically, being shy is being really good at reading people. That's the skill. Reading emotions on people. And the skill that's missing, there's a couple of skills that are missing. One is people skills, is just knowing how to behave among people, strangers specifically. Knowing how to carry on a typical kind of chit-chat conversation. And the other skill is knowing kind of the rules of etiquette, rules of behavior. And once you have those, and you already have the skill of being able to read people, you're well on your way to being charismatic. So that was a change in perspective. Instead of shyness being something that's broken, or something like a permanent built-in characteristic that I can't do anything about, it was one skill among 3 or more that I needed in order to be comfortable and capable around other people. So that's a very different way of looking at it. Instead of being just a victim to it and wishing it would go away, it became a stepping stone and gave me a path to becoming not shy. And I did that. And that new perspective was gained with a piece of information. So it's a good way, if you're trying to get a new perspective on something, one way to do it is to ask yourself a question and ponder it. Different questions can provoke different kinds of answers. So ask a good question. There are several that can help you get a new perspective. Or another way you can go about it, and sometimes it works better for some things, is to just try to get more information. Just try to get more knowledge about whatever it is. I did the same thing with public speaking. I didn't really know a lot about it. I didn't have very much experience doing it, and I wasn't very good at it. So my first step was I just read about it, and I learned a lot in doing that. Probably one of the most useful things I learned right off the bat was that it's completely normal to be nervous before a speech. It's not any indication that there's something wrong with you if you're nervous before a speech. That's totally normal. As a matter of fact, I remember there was one little tidbit in there about Johnny Carson, who goes out and at the time went out and did his monologue every night, and yet they had measured his heart rate before his monologue, and it was something like 180 or something, which is really fast. He was clearly had his adrenaline pumping every night. Like he apparently never got used to it. You would think that somebody that did that all the time, that after a while it wouldn't make them nervous, but every night that happened to him. And I thought, okay, so that's kind of like running in a race or doing something athletic where you're kind of, you have a lot of adrenaline pumping. It's just part of doing it. It's not like there's anything wrong with you. It just means that you really care about this and you want to do well. So that was a nice shift in perspective about speaking. And I got that from reading, from just trying to learn about it. Reading, listening to a podcast, watching a video, even talking to a friend of yours that knows a lot about it. Another example of a shift in perspective is when I was first starting to speak, and I would go out and speak to like Rotary clubs and Kiwanis clubs, service clubs are called, where just a group of people get together and try to do something helpful for other people. But they have these meetings, and they usually have a speaker at the meetings that speaks for like 20 minutes. And so I knew that they're always looking for speakers, and they don't pay you, so it's a good way to break in to speaking. So you can just get a list of the Kiwanis clubs and the Rotary clubs in your area and call them up, because every city has a lot of them. And so I just would just call up the local ones, and I've noticed that I was keeping track. So I noticed I got one speech booked for every 7 phone calls I made. And I had been reading about making cold calls and sales and stuff like that. And I got the idea that, it's a very common thing for salespeople that make calls to get discouraged, because you get a lot of no's to the few yeses that you get. So it can be very demoralizing and discouraging. And you don't want to have that attitude when you call. You don't want to be like, okay, you probably don't want this either, but you know what I mean? You want to maintain your morale while you're doing this thing, or you just don't come across very well. And they're like, I don't want to hear this guy talk. So it's important that you have a way of looking at this that doesn't discourage you. Right? So a very common perspective for salespeople is that this is a numbers game. A certain amount are going to reject you, and it doesn't matter. Any particular one doesn't matter. And that's how, and I did eventually gain that perspective. I mean, actually, not eventually, it didn't take very long. I totally lost my concern about this particular call, which really relaxed me and improved my success rate. So I was like, it's 1 out of 7. Okay, not that one. Okay, not that one. Oh, there's one. I knew the average was 1 out of 7, so I just didn't worry about it. And that kind of thing, that reframe, a different perspective on something, just looking at it in a different way can make you more effective and successful. That's a good example. It changes your feelings and your attitude about it and the way you approach it. And for something that has already happened, there's always the old standby, tried and true reframe, new perspective is it's a learning experience. I mean, if it's something that's already happened, you might as well make the most of it. And that's one way to do it, is go, what can I learn from this so I don't make this mistake again, or so that things can be better in the future? But usually, or at least often, you can do even better than that. You can actually use it and take advantage of it rather than merely learning something from it. But if that's the best you can do is learn something from it, be better off in the future because of it, that's good enough. You can honestly say in the future that you're better off because that happened. You can use that terrible thing or that not good thing to make something good happen in the future. Because one of the things that a reframe can do for you, or a change in perspective can do for you, is just help you embrace what happens instead of bemoaning it or wishing it hadn't happened. You can embrace the fact that it happened, or at least go to some degree toward embracing it or accepting it. I remember reading about a therapist who was working with a father who had a very disobedient young daughter. She was really stubborn. And the therapist was using an NLP technique or principle that in the right context, almost everything is a good thing in the right context. So a lot of times one reframe or one new way of looking at something is to say that bad thing is a really good thing in a certain context. So the therapist just said, now imagine some young man, when she gets a little older, trying to take advantage of her. So that perspective immediately changes how he looks at her quote unquote disobedience or her stubbornness. He has fairly good confidence that when she gets to that position, she will not let anybody do anything to her that she doesn't want to have done, right? She's not that kind of person. She's not obedient. She's not passive. She's not a victim. So that's one possible way of creating a reframe, is to think about the thing that you don't like, especially a characteristic about yourself or somebody some characteristic about somebody else that you're dealing with that you don't really like, and think, in what context would that be a good thing? Would that be a good characteristic? So somebody, for example, that loves to read and doesn't really want to do anything but read might have the perspective that that's just a waste of time and you shouldn't do that. There's more important things to do in this world. In what context would that be a good thing? How about an editor for a publishing house? How about a news aggregator? Depending on what it is that you like to read, there are a lot of possibilities where that characteristic in a certain context would be a really good thing, not a bad thing. So that's one possible way of looking at your situation in a different way. So that thing that you thought of earlier, that you think is bad, that you don't want, that you resist, that you wish didn't happen or wasn't happening, is there a context where that would be a good thing? And really think about it. Ponder that. This is not like, if you can't think of an answer in 10 seconds, then it's a dumb question. Ponder it for several days. Just in between time, not like you have to just sit there for several days, but while you're driving, while you're doing dishes, while your mind isn't otherwise occupied, ponder it some more. Say, is there a place where that would be a positive characteristic, or that would be a good thing? And if you find something and it's a good one, it can really change your perspective on it. I remember reading some story, I think it's from The Art of War, but I'm not sure. It was a story about two armies that had met and were going to go to battle. And they were both encamped not too far from each other. And a battle was going to be happening soon. And the general found that there was one of the people in his army used to be a thief and was a really good thief. And so the general came up with an idea. So this is a way of using what you have. And that's a good way to create a change in perspective. Is to take what you don't want. Like obviously you don't want a thief among if you have a group, a business or whatever, you don't want a thief among your group. But he did have a thief among his group. So, the question is then, how can I use this? Consider it a resource and go, how can I use it? What could I use it for? So the general got an idea, and he had the thief sneak into the general's tent, the other general, the enemy general's tent, and take his sword. And then the next day, and he snuck in there, took his sword, and nobody knew that he'd come there and left. He was just a really good thief. The next day, the general had the sword sent to the enemy general and said, we found this. The next day, he had the thief sneak in there and steal something else. I don't remember what it was. And the next day, the other general returned it to the enemy general. And the third day, they had the thief actually take the enemy general's pillow, and then they returned it the next day, and then the army left. They were just too freaked out because clearly the thief could have killed that general while he was there, and he seemed unstoppable, right? So a huge battle was avoided by the use of something that you would normally consider a negative thing. So that's another way to generate a different perspective on something, is to go, whatever this bad thing is that you don't want, that you're resisting, is there a way you could use it? Is there something about it that you could use to get what you want, to make what you want to happen in this world? And then just ponder that for a day or two. Just ponder that. Or sit and do a concentrated thing where you just try to come up with 10 ways that you could use it. And even if they're kind of crazy ideas, just squeeze 10 ideas out of your head and write them on a piece of paper. Just set yourself a goal, or just set yourself a goal of, I'm going to sit here for 1 hour and come up with as many ideas as I can about how I can use this. And a lot of ideas will be stupid. Some of them you won't like, but every once in a while you'll get a gem. And that can completely change your perspective, change the way you feel about it, change how you interact with it, and really change the trajectory of your life depending on how important this is. I saw a pretty good example of this. There's a documentary I think it was called The Biggest Little Farm. These people had started a farm, and their orchard, after a while, was overrun with snails. And they were trying to get rid of them, and they showed they were just going around picking them off by hand, all these snails, and putting them in a bucket, and the bucket completely was overflowing with snails. And it was just too labor intensive. They had other things they needed to be doing than just picking snails. And they, so this is clearly a problem, right? Anybody in their right mind would go, this is a problem. You have snails eating your orchard. But they were able to see it as a resource. They're like, how could we use this? So they unleashed the ducks they found out that ducks really like snails. So then they would just run their ducks through the orchard, and the ducks just scarfed down the snails, just thought they were great little delicacies. So they got free food to feed their ducks. The ducks were pooping fertilizer all over the place. They didn't need to spray any pesticides to kill the snails. They were trying to grow things organically. And they solved their snail problem. So what was a problem ended up being a resource, literally, duck food. So that's one really good way of getting a different perspective on what you think of as a bad thing, is how could you use it? How could you see this as a resource, and what could you do with it if it was a resource? And ponder that one. A lot of people I know spend a lot of time on the road commuting to and from work. They spend hours on the road every week. Now, that could be just a pain in the butt. You really wish it didn't happen. It's just a big waste of your time. Or it could be a great opportunity to learn a language and practice it aloud. or take some courses from great courses from the Learning Company, or I think it's called the Learning Company. They just take the best college professors in the country and record their entire semester or quarter, and then you can buy those or rent them or stream them, and you can take college courses while you drive down the road. You could also, of course, think. I remember seeing once, I think it was Zig Ziglar, he's a sales trainer, said, I think this is the number, but this is a long time ago when I read this, but I think he said that the average commuter spends enough time in their car that if they were listening to college courses, they could get a 2-year college education in 3 years of commuting or something like that. But anyway, the point is that you can gain a lot from that period of time that you're in your car. There's something that you can do with it. You can think of that as a resource and go, how can I take advantage of the fact that I have to do this thing? And ponder that and come up with some good ways to really use it and think of it as a valuable resource that you can use. And I'll finish this with a study that was done at Washington University in St. Louis. The researchers interviewed people that had either been in a plane crash or a tornado or a mass shooting. And they interviewed them twice. They interviewed the survivors a few weeks after the traumatic event, and then again 3 years later. In the first interview, some people said they could find something good that came out of the event. This is only a few weeks after the event. And some people said they could find something good about it that came out of that. Some reported they had realized life was too short not to pursue their most important goals, or they realized how important their family was to them. And then in the follow-up interview, 3 years later, those were the people who had recovered from that trauma most successfully. So that is a great example of the value of a perspective. Like they may not have done anything physically different, but because of their different perspective, they dealt with the trauma most successfully. That's the power of changing the way you look at something. This is Adam Lee Kahn on The Atom Bomb. This Atom Bomb podcast episode is sponsored by Anchor, a podcast platform, the one I'm using to make this podcast. It's super easy to use and allows you to easily create your own podcast. You can record and edit your audio right onto the app. In fact, you can do everything on your phone. Anchor also makes it easy to monetize your podcast and get wide distribution. Anchor automatically makes your podcast available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. You can download the Anchor app for free or go to anchor.fm to get started.